So I want to talk to you today about the Matching Girls of Ivoryton, and Elizabeth Alvord, our local librarian at Ivoryton Public Library, found this picture for me. These are the women whose jobs it was to match ivory so that the keys on one piano would match, otherwise it wouldn't sell. I'll talk more about that. I first have to give an origin story. I kind of gave the origin story as to why I care about this and why this has captured my imagination. This is how I write books. I don't know how best-selling authors do it. I'm not a best-selling author, but I know what happens to me is I am researching something else and a line in a document jumps out and I think, oh, I want to know more. In this case, I was writing a cookbook. If you've ever, if you know me at all, that line right there should get belly laughs. I'm not a cook, I'm not a baker. I don't enjoy the kitchen. I pass through it to go outside. I kind of know where the pans are, but I'm on my local library board. And we had talked about having a cookbook. There had been a cookbook written by the ladies of the Ivoryton Library in the 1880s, I believe. And I thought, well, we could resurrect this, but the only way I could write a cookbook is to write a tongue-in-cheek one. So we included some of the recipes from the the original cookbook, which included pork cake, exactly what it sounds like. And then we got some other less disgusting. And we did try, my kitchen was the test kitchen. We did make a pork cake and it was nasty, but we did this cookbook and looking through the volumes and volumes of records from local factories in Ivoryton, I came across Matching Girls. So if you've never been to Ivoryton, you can be excused. Ivoryton is part of Essex. Essex Village is where you take all your out-of-town guests to walk them down to the river where the ducks live and show them the River Museum and say, this is Connecticut because it's beautiful. You go one town over and it's Centerbrook, and then you go another town over, still within the same town, and that's Ivoryton. See, you didn't know that, and I'm bet now you're happy that you did. Ivoryton was first called West Centerbrook, and it's always bothered me as a transplant from the Missouri Ozarks. Why can't Yankees be more original with their town names? Count how many times Haddam is part of a town name, but that's another PowerPoint, and we won't go into that. So before Ivory, West Centerbrook, what is now Ivoryton, was really just a series of subsistence farms. And those farms were peopled by families that a lot of them could trace their names back to the Revolutionary War. Just a small little place, no big deal. And then came Samuel Comstock. He was born in Ivoryton. His father was a ship captain. And he worked for his uncle as a comb maker, like as in hair comb. His company started in Centerbrook, but then he decided he could do better on his own. And so he moved back down Falls River, which is a very slow moving river. I thought it was a lake, back down Falls River toward Ivoryton. So this is one of the Comstock homes, and I only include this picture because if you look at this home in the smaller, what looks like a sunroom off to the side, if you head directly up that way, that's my backyard. Woohoo! I'm not on any historic maps. My house is a relatively new 100-year-old money pit. So I want to talk a little bit about ivory. Why ivory? It's hard to imagine another product that gained the cultural significance of ivory. I was thinking about, maybe some certain kinds of technology, but for an actual you can touch it product. If you've ever seen real ivory, it has this translucent quality, not like pearl, but certainly better than fish bones. And if a young man wanted to impress his young woman and he bought her a hair comb and it was made out of fish bone, she would know and he would sink somewhat in her love of him. I just keep going back to this Alice Walker poem called We Alone, and it was published in a series, in a poetry book by her in 1984 and included these last couple of paragraphs. Who knows why we attach such importance to certain elements as opposed to feathers, but ivory was one of those things that we attach quite a lot of importance to. When I say ivory combs, this is what I'm talking about, and they were intricately carved and just incredibly beautiful. So they were intricately carved by hand. So you can imagine how long that took. And then came, if you've never been to the Connecticut River Museum, I can't recommend it enough. I put my history teacher aunt, who was 82 at the time, in this thing, and I didn't think I was going to be able to pull her out. This was an early submarine called a turtle. And Phineas Pratt, who was a clockmaker at the time, came up with this timer for the submersible. That has nothing to do with Ivory, but just to put him in his historical place. He also created this incredible circular saw that allowed the cutting of ivory so that a production could increase to 40 of those ivory combs a day, which was rather incredible. And with that saw, Ivoryton quickly added new machine-made products. Samuel Comstock, whose home I showed you, one of his first products was screwdrivers. He added spatulas, letter openers, toothpicks, billiard balls, and then later came piano keys. So when I talk about Ivory and Ivoryton, which obviously West Centerbrook was renamed Ivoryton, it's this perfect storm of all sorts of cultural trends, including people's interest in ivory, but also pianos. There are some excellent books written, and I've only read 2 so far, but there are some excellent books written about the rise of pianos. Originally, the keys were wood, but those wore down over time. So people figured out to cover the wood with a very thin sheet of ivory. And that made all the difference to Ivoryton. Pianos were made in the United States before there was technically a United States, but by the 1840s, it would have been very hard to find a home without one, no matter if it was a mansion or not. Sort of like televisions in the 1960s. Suddenly everyone had a television. And this last point, by 1867, one historian said that the piano was second only in importance to the kitchen stove in American homes. And the interest just kept building. By 1896, the 5 largest piano makers were American. By 1909, 365,000 pianos were made in the United States, and there were 295 manufacturers. That's not a long period of time, so this was a boom. And it was also said, and I just sort of touched on this a second ago, pianos were considered the great leveler. Obviously, you could have a grand piano, and that would signify that you had a lot of money. But pianos could be found in log cabins. They could be found in mansions. And weirdly, social observers of the day thought that the piano, like music calms the savage beast, that having a piano in the home was a great antidote for relieving the monotony of factory work. And more people were going to factories which were not necessarily mentally challenging, so they could come home and play the piano, but the pianos were made by that monotonous factory work. At one point, 90% of all ivory coming into the United States passed through Ivoryton or Deep River. I'm going to focus more on Ivoryton, but this picture is of some bleaching sheds where the ivory would be brought to bake in the sun, basically, in preparation for it being used as a covering for piano keys. The big factory for the longest time in Ivoryton was Comstock Cheney, which was Samuel Comstock, and also a new partner, George Cheney, who had been an ivory trader. So you had this innovative, I don't want to call him an inventor because he wasn't really that, but he was very savvy about the latest technology, Samuel Comstock, coupled with George Cheney, who very much knew the ivory trade. Here's where I have to stop for a moment because I would be remiss to talk about the ivory trade and not talk about how very problematic it was and continues to be. This is an actual picture. A lot of the ivory that came to Ivoryton and Deep River came from Zanzibar, but all the elephants didn't live on the shore. So what would happen would be ivory hunters would go into Africa, inland Africa, to the countries there, kill the elephants, and then the ivory needed to be transported, but it wasn't like there were roads or railroads. So the ivory traders would commandeer local Africans to carry the tusks with them. And when I say commandeer, they didn't pay them. They basically introduced them into slavehood And so the Africans would walk with these huge tusks on their heads to the ports, which would then give ivory traders two products to sell, both the ivory, the tusks, and the people who had brought the tusks to the port. It doesn't get any worse than that. So tusks cost lives. And if you've ever heard that Dr. Livingstone, I presume, which was what a Welsh journalist said when he finally stumbled upon the Scottish physician, David Livingstone, who was in Africa, he estimated, and this was him estimating, that for every tusk that was brought out of Africa, 5 Africans died. Not all of them wanted to carry the tusks. Conversely, and this is a great topic explored in the 1990s book, Complicity, written by some of my former colleagues at the Current. George Reed of Deep River's Pratt Reed and Company, also an ivory company, was a devout abolitionist. So on the one hand, you had people in Connecticut reaping massive riches from an industry that was flawed from the get-go. It was also incredibly hard. I would be remiss if I didn't mention what happened to the elephants themselves. A lot of talk back here was about harvesting the tusk, which sounds like you go out and you pick a piece of corn. It was not. The ivory industry decimated the elephant population, and it continues to threaten it. Scientists are now looking at tuskless elephants that they assume are being born from an evolutionary standpoint for their own protection. Harvesting the tusk generally involved cutting the tusk out of the head of the elephant. Sometimes they would kill the elephant first, and sometimes they would just cut the tusks off the elephant, and about a third of it was inside the elephant's skull. And so it was and remains fairly gruesome, all for this beautiful product that women could wear in their hair. 175-pound tusk would supply the coating, the covering for the keys of 45 pianos. The tusks would arrive on wagons just like this. They were known as bark. They were covered with this brownish, ugly thing that was removed by soaking the tusk in hydrogen peroxide. And this was all incredibly studied and figured out, because obviously it's ivory. Part of the reason ivory was so expensive and considered so precious was so much had to happen to get these tusks delivered to Connecticut. The tusks would then be moved to the bleaching sheds, like I showed you earlier, and it generally took about 30 days of sunshine. So it could be 30 days, it could take longer, New England weather, but after about 30 days in the bleaching sheds, which look like to me glass, greenhouses, the tusks would be brought to the factory to be junked, which sounds good, but that basically meant cut into cylinders, and they tried to create as little waste as possible. Again, this is gold here. Those cylinders would then be blocked, and then rectangular sections would be cut from the keys. They would be cut by Pratt's circular saw, a modern day version of it, with water spraying on it so that nothing caught fire. The smell in the factories, from what I've read, it smelled like gunpowder and burning bone, which would make sense. Okay, so that's the process of how those keys came to you. Piano keys now are plastic. They no longer are covered in ivory. And that mostly started, and I'm probably pulling this out of the air, a good 50 years ago. Ivory ceased to be the covering for piano keys. So I'm doing all this research, and I live in Ivoryton, so I was so fascinated by this. I love moving to a new town and then finding out about it. I never do research beforehand, which explains why I've briefly lived in towns I really didn't like. So I'm doing all this research, and I'm hanging out at the library. I'm friends with Elizabeth Alvord, the librarian, and she's written this incredible article that ran, I forget where, Connecticut Explored. It was wonderful. The town has signs up that say, we know how we got here. So there's not a lot of hiding our heads in the sand to pretend that, oh, well, Ivory just dropped down here. And so this was at one point an incredibly wealthy town. It no longer is, but I give a lot of credit to the denizens of the town and that they're very clear on how they got here. Deep River as well. But I can't find a lot of information on the matching girls other than a brief mention. And I haven't spent nearly enough time with the ledgers, but I will. So I decided, but I really want to tell this story. So I thought, all right, I'll pick a decade. And I picked the 1880s. And it wasn't just, oh, I like the way 1880 looks. It's an awesome decade. And when we think about technology, we think about, smartphones, smart houses, and all that. But technology in the 1880s was moving forward at a pace that made a lot of people uncomfortable. They used the word modernity. They were uncomfortable with how quickly things were changing. And there are a lot of similarities between the 1880s and the 2000s in my mind. But I decided that I would pick the 1880s and place these matching girls, what I could find about them, in the 1880s and write about them that way. Sounds easy, right? Okay, finally, we get to the matching girls. You thought I'd never mention them, but I promise, now I will. Their job was fairly straightforward. They were to take the junked tusks and figure out which matches which seems like an easy job, right? But I don't know if you can even tell this, there are 4 different colors of white in this square. I can see the off blue one, kind of the second one in. The others I have a really hard time, but if you can imagine, it was quite a skill, and it was considered too, not delicate, too artistic for the lunky men to figure it out. So they started to hire women to match the ivory, to become matching girls. Okay, so first they would hire the local women who wanted to work. And once they'd hired everyone who was interested, the company, which at one point had 900 employees, they began to advertise. I've not seen one of the ads, but I've read about it, where the ads would emphasize that, oh, you can live in the country, and mothers, don't worry about your children, your daughters, because we have factory families that will look over them. And from everything I've seen, that was in fact the case. We'll talk about welfare capitalism in a little bit, where the young women could feel comfortable coming to Ivoryton. And they advertised in New York and in Boston, thinking that they could bring in recent immigrants who would be looking for work. Here's where things get weird. As I'm researching, because I want to accurately reflect what it was like to be a woman in the labor market at that time, the numbers are all over the map, and we have to acknowledge that the Census Bureau doesn't always ask the questions I need asked. The questions change over time. Every decade, questions are added and removed from the census questions. And in the 1840s, no one was paying attention to African-American women who were held in slavery. So that's a huge cohort that wasn't included in the number of women in the labor market. But just roughly in the 1840s, about 10% of white women, the only women who were asked, held jobs outside the home, which climbed to 1870. And the 1870 figure includes African-American women, and then to 24% by 1920. These are just the bare numbers, but interpretation of these numbers say the numbers were most likely a lot higher. Starting in the 1870s, as women tended to go in, feel more comfortable going into the labor market, not working on the family farm, not taking in washing, marriage and birth rates started to drop. The vanguard for women in the labor market has always been single women, except as of 1900, more married women entered the labor market. Women who worked outside the home, that was a phrase that was shot around when I was a kid, were by and large mostly single, but there were plenty of married women doing that. Prior to the 1900s, if a woman worked outside the home, had gainful employment, she was either in house service, she worked in a larger home, or she did factory work. So this doesn't apply to the 1880s, but it's fascinating to me that during wars, there's always been a push on the part of the US government via all means of propaganda to get women to feel comfortable going into the labor market. What's funny to me is that the studies don't bear out that women were that uncomfortable going into the labor market. That was a woman who came from a particular socioeconomic level. You get below a particular socioeconomic level, an economic level, and the women knew that they would be working. But who hasn't heard of Rosie the Riveter? That was part of the notion to get women who had had resources to stay home to go to work, do the job he left behind. This wasn't just World War II, though. This occurred in World War I, and this is a poster from World War I, to try to get women who otherwise might not have considered going into the labor market because they needed people in the factories to go into the factories. But again, what often isn't covered, and these are always the stories I'm more interested in, is that there were a horde of women already in the labor market who were fairly comfortable being there, didn't feel a social stigma about it, but they were the ones who needed to work. So we may have some misconceptions about women in the labor force, particularly as we go back through time. There's this mythical, which I always bought into, that it was considered somehow, there was a social stigma against a woman working outside the home. Yes, again, if you look at a particular economic level for a family, for everybody else, there wasn't one. So some studies put female labor market about 11% pre-1860. And again, they're only looking at white women. It doesn't take into account women who worked on their own family farms. It didn't take into account women who were enslaved and forced to work for free. And again, it doesn't take into account that the US Census Bureau really didn't talk to women very much in the early years. More recent studies say that pre-1860, 56% of the American workforce was female, depending on how you define workforce. Okay, that much I know, and that would maybe or maybe not be included in a book of nonfiction. So here's where I have to start making things up about the matching girls. And I'm asking myself questions like, okay, the first thing is everybody called women girls. Were these girls actually older women, or were they preteens? In some industries where the records were kept, there was a tendency to hire older women so that they would not be tempting sexually to younger male factory workers, which really doesn't say much for younger male factory workers. It makes them sound like they're animals in a cage ready to go. But the common wisdom was that they would be susceptible to women to whom they weren't legally attached. Does that make sense? The second thing was, I started to wonder, were the workers, the matching girls, immigrants? In Ivoryton, most definitely. Ivoryton at one time had very ethnic-centric neighborhoods known as, I'll let you read it, and I'm sorry about the Pollock town, not a word I normally use. So the chances are that yes, even if they hadn't gone farther afield to hire matching girls, just staying within Ivoryton, they would have found a pretty broad base. Were the women well treated? Yes, but perhaps. There was this patriarchal sense that the factory owners owed protection to the women in the workforce. And it would behoove them to take care of those women, if for no other reason than they would need to hire. Sometimes a woman would get married and move away. Sometimes a woman would get married and continue working. So chances are, yes, they were. Were there women of color in the factories? Absolutely. The African-American population of Connecticut doubled between 1850 and 1880. And if you haven't gone to their website, go see New London's Black Heritage Trail. There were definitely families of color in this area. Were the women paid well? And this is where I need to spend more time with the ledgers. But the average male factory worker made $1.34 a day in the 1880s, and that's about $37 now, back when $37 meant something. So we've always known there's a gender pay gap, and people were talking about it as early as 1860. So it's anybody's guess. I'm assuming that for all the company records that the Iverton Library has, this is in there. I just haven't found it yet. Did the women work hard? Well, you saw the picture of the 4 different colors of white. I don't know, I would think eye strain would be a problem. They were sometimes asked to do clerical work as well. So there was a lot of cross-pollination between, different parts of the factory, but they mostly worked in well-lit and well-ventilated rooms, and they were watched over by a male overseer who was there for dual purposes, not only to protect them, but to make sure they stayed and did their job. From what I can tell, they worked 6 days a week with a half day on Saturday. When they were free to go in and spend their money. I found what I think is a letter from one matching girl home. And she complained a little bit that the townsfolk treated the matching girls a little bit like interlopers. And, women would hug husbands' wives a little tighter when the matching girls walked by, but that their money spent very well at the local stores. So I've mentioned welfare capitalism. If you don't know what it is, I won't read this to you, but this is basically what it is. On the surface, it looks like a really good thing in that factory owners, to continue talking about the 1880s, factory owners wanted to make sure their workers were happy so that their workers would work harder. And welfare capitalism took the form of all kinds of like company housing. There are some houses, pointing like you can see it. There are some houses about 3 streets over from me that were factory houses for Comstock Cheney, and they're still numbered. Factory housing, a factory store where endless credit was extended. In Ivoryton, it included things like a bicycle shed where people could borrow bicycles. I've written a lot about Colonel Albert Pope in Hartford, and he was a welfare capitalist as well. He would offer free lunches and even eventually said the families of factory workers could come eat lunches there at his factory in Frog Hollow. The idea again was to make the workers happy so that they would work harder, stay on the job, and there would be basically brand loyalty. Iverton had a town band, but if you look here, I don't see any women involved, but with their own uniforms, and they would have competitions with the Deep River Town Band, which was also funded by the ivory factory there. Ivoryton had a trolley, which is hard to imagine if you've ever driven through here, it's like where'd they put it? But again, all of this was an attempt to make the place attractive. Ivoryton's kind of in the middle of nowhere, so they wanted to make this little town kind of a bit of a paradise for whoever came to work here. And the thinking was a happy employee, worked harder and stayed on the job. So you didn't have to turn around and spend money and train new people. They would be here, they would be happy. This is the Iverton Inn, which is not far from, it's in the backyard of my house actually. Very gracious little place. And here are some of the factory girls with their names. And this picture was taken around 1905, and I'm only guessing, but it looks like it was something of a company picnic. That's also part of welfare capitalism. Have picnics, have dances. There were a lot of dances down here. Ivoryton Playhouse was originally opened as a place for factory workers to come, kind of like a Chautauqua, not quite on that level, but that the idea was we want our people happy. So when I think about were these matching girls treated well, comparatively speaking, they most probably were. I'll spend time and see if I can disprove that for myself. So I talked really fast, and you can't just come up with a PowerPoint unless you have a lot of sources. So these are some of mine. And since this will be recorded, you're free to check any of these sources. I do want to give a shout out to the next to the last source, Elizabeth Alvord, head librarian at Ivoryton Public Library, because she's been so gracious about just opening up the stacks and letting me spend time in there. Originally to research for the cookbook, but since then to research for this.